So could you explain the beef I see on Twitter between trad Anglicans and actual Catholics of the Anglican tradition like yourself? I know nothing of the history. Okay, so if you want the history behind, okay, I guess I'll give like a 10-minute sort of exposition of the entire history of the English Church. That should be not too difficult. So hopefully I don't forget any of the details. So basically, what you have is you have St. Joseph of Arimathea first took the faith to the English Isles shortly after the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he was the uncle of our Lord, interestingly enough. And he took, it's said in some traditions that he actually took our Lord to the English Isles. So believe it, don't believe it, but it's definitely based, so therefore it's true. Because St. Joseph of Arimathea was I think he was a merchant of some sort, if I'm remembering correctly. So that is where the faith of the Angles originally began. So what you have after that is throughout some of the 2nd century, you'll get Tertullian talking about how there are Christians in the British Isles. You get, I believe, the Council of Nicaea mentions that some, no, I'm not gonna. The wife brought me in some pizza, and I'm like, no, I'm not gonna be eating that on stream. So you also have the Council of Nicaea, I believe, mentioning that there were some bishops who were invited from the British Isles to come. But that's about what you get from the early sort of pre-Gregorian era. As you get mentioned here, mentioned there, you get some legends and stuff like that. But it isn't anything very solid, because you have to remember the British Isles were like the edge of the world. So there wasn't much going on there. So, beginning in the time of Pope St. Gregory the Great, what you have is you have Pope St. Gregory the Great sending St. Augustine of Canterbury to kind of reestablish the church in Britain and to bring to bring a lot more organization to it, because it was kind of before this it's like the Wild West of the world. So there wasn't much good organization. They say they had fallen back on some of the traditions which the rest of the church has accepted, especially the date of Easter, which was accepted at the Council of Nicaea and such. So that's what you had with St. Augustine of Canterbury. Then you have all the way throughout the medieval church, you have this just normal sort of outpost of the Catholic Church, which is in England. And then during, let me remember, Henry II, if I'm remembering correctly. Henry II. Was it Henry II? Henry II of England. I think it was Henry II. Was he the guy that did a bunch of bad stuff? Yes. There you go. So under Henry II, you begin to have some trouble, and there had been trouble before, and there is going to be trouble after. This is going to remind you of a different Henry. But Henry II had some issues with the church. So there was this sort of strained relationship between the church and the state in England. He wanted to prosecute a priest who'd been doing some bad stuff, and the civil magistrate, it wasn't him, it was one of his governors. The civil magistrate decided to execute the priest, and this is a huge no-no, because the church does not rely on the judicial sentencing of the state. We're completely independent of it, and we have that right of self-government as a perfect society. So you can't judge our priests. And Henry decided, well, this was a good opportunity to gain a little bit more authority when it came to the church. So he told the Pope to heck off. And then eventually this led to the death of St. Thomas of Becket, which was not a good thing. Obviously, he was a martyr for the faith. So you have this strained relationship. England got put under interdict for all of the shenanigans that happened with some of the royalty. And you see that there never was this really amazing relationship with form between the civil power and the church in England. And then in, I want to say the 1530s, if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, what you had was King Henry VIII, who decided that he had the true authority over the church in England, and that the Pope had been a usurper when it came to the church, and that he had authority over those temporal aspects of the church. So he decided to take charge, and I think that's a fair way of representing. I think most Anglicans would be happy with the way that I represented Henry right there. That he saw himself. And this long-term debate that had been between the church and the state in England, that what you had was the king as representative of the laity had authority over the temporal aspects of the church, and the Pope hath no jurisdiction in England. That's what you had. So at that point, the theology didn't really change for another about 2 or 3 decades. Is when you started to get the shift to a more reformed theology, and then you had Queen Mary, who reestablished the church in England, and then she died. Unfortunately, well, that was after King Edward the Sixth had reigned for a short period of time. That's when a lot of the reform happened under Cranmer et al. And Vermigli, and all those guys were there during that time. Mary reestablishes the church, and then Mary dies, and then you have the long Elizabethan settlement, where Queen Elizabeth the First took over, and she really solidified a lot of the theology and in such of the what would be known as the Church of England, but really is not the Church of England. It's the Henryist sect who had schismed from the rest of the church, and they're not properly the church in England. So that is up to that point. Now, in the late 16th century, you had a sect which were known as the Puritans, who began to arise in England, who thought that the Reformation did not go far enough, that the Church in England, Church of England, I'm sorry, that they had kept some papist elements, such as signing the cross in baptism, such as having a set liturgy, such as the wearing of vestments, such as the use of bishops. So the Puritan sect really didn't like that. So there had been some debates which went on between the two, and this went on for quite some decades. After Elizabeth, you had James, and a lot of stuff happened under him, especially the translation of the King James Bible. And then you had King Charles, and King Charles is going to be very important, because you had then the Caroline divines, and then we're going to meet another character. Where is he? I like his picture because he kind of looks based. This guy, who I 100% think was actually just a Catholic martyr. Where is he? There he is, Archbishop Laud. Archbishop William Laud. You have him, and he decided that, oh wow, you Puritans think you're cool, like burning vestments and like saying all this garbage, and they did have some like extremely violent streaks. So he's like, you know what, guys, I'm going to cut your noses off and your ears off. And based anti-Puritan, he went off against the Puritans. Then in the 1650s, what you had a certain revolt which happened, and then it fell into civil war. Archbishop Laud, unfortunately, was executed, and also King Charles I was executed, unfortunately. So, yeah, that's what happened. The Puritans took over. You had the Westminster Assembly, which codified a lot of Reformed doctrine during the time. And it was just a very bloody period. And then you had the reascension of the monarch after the collapse of the Puritans happened. And really after this point, there never really the Church of England never really was the same. There was a significant damage which was done. You didn't really have this unified force like you had in the Elizabethan, Jacobite, and Caroline eras. There never was that strength that they had again, and that unity of theology. And this eventually led to the tolerance of the Puritans. So that led to the proliferation of denominations, which happened, and break-offs from the Church of England. So you had a lot of stagnant sort of church life throughout the remainder of the 17th. I mean, it wasn't terrible, nothing like it is today, but throughout the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century, you had this sort of stagnant church life. You never had the glories of the Caroline divines again. You never had the glories of the Jacobite divines. There was no glorious Bishop Lancelot Andrews, who was definitely one of my favorite Anglicans. Never had that again. So fast forwarding, I don't really know much about 18th century history, except that it wasn't too good. So in the 1830s, you had what was called the Oxford movement. A few divines, well, it really was actually younger students at Oxford, led by E.B. Pusey, who was a professor of, I think he was a professor, Old Testament. He was an Old Testament professor. And a few others, most famously John Henry Newman. They began to very much dislike the relationship that the church and the state had in England, interestingly enough. That's what it was. They thought that the state was definitely corrupting the church by that close union. So they wrote what were called the Tracts for the Times. There was 90 of them, and they wanted to bring back some Catholicity in the theology of the Church of England. And what you're going to get at first is most people aren't going to know this, but what you're going to get at first from a lot of the Tractarians is you're going to get genuinely conservative Anglican thought, with sort of like ressourcement of Anglican divines, and put in contextualized into Catholic theology. That's what you're going to get. It was really in Anglican theology, it was a very glorious movement, which had become, they weren't papist by any means. They were still Reformed. They didn't have the sacrificial Roman vestments. They went along with the rubrics of the prayer book. It was really just a conservative Anglican movement with some interesting political beliefs and a ressourcement of older Anglican theologians and such. And then later, you had, let me think, in the late 1840s, 1850s. I'm trying to remember a lot of dates. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. When did John Henry Newman convert? I want to say 1848 is when he converted. Newman convert to Catholicism. There you go. 1845. Okay. So this was a little over a decade into the Oxford movement. So it wasn't that all these guys instantly went papist. But in the 1840s and 50s, a lot of the movement, and not like a majority of it, but there was definitely a significant minority of the movement, decided to convert to Roman Catholicism. A lot of Anglican laymen converted to Roman Catholicism. And then some of the more papist elements of the movement were taken out. But in the later 19th century, you had what was called the ritualist movement, which is what you would think of as more so Anglo-Catholicism today. Original Anglo-Catholics would be seen as extremely conservative in their Anglican bent. They're probably more historically rooted in Anglican thought than most extremely low church Anglicans are today. It definitely was a very conservative movement. But later 19th century, of the ritualists, they began bringing the candles on the altar. They began praying the Ave. They produced some English breviaries. They did a lot of stuff when it came to the ritual elements behind so-called Anglican worship. So they came into formation, but the state really didn't like that. So some of these guys were jailed for praying the Ave Maria. These guys were definitely not befriended by a lot of the Anglican establishment, because remember the state had a great deal of control over things that would go on. So if you had liturgical heterodoxy, they would bonk you over the head and tell you to go take a hike. So this sort of movement of ritualist Anglo-Catholicism developed throughout the 20th century throughout England. But what is going to be important for us is going to be America, because this is really where the Ordinariate is going to come from. A lot of American influences. So in the late 19th century, you had a lot of the Episcopal Church. You had certain movements within the Episcopal Church towards ritualism and towards Anglo-Catholicism, and a certain group of priests and laymen, and I believe I'm not sure whether there was bishops with them. I think there might have been. But a certain group broke off and created what's called the Reformed Episcopal Church in order to bring back the Reformed heritage in the past and try to fight the mean Tractarians. And then throughout the early and mid 20th century, you had a good deal of Anglo-Catholic development within the United States. And then eventually the 60s and 70s hit the Episcopal Church. And it hit them hard, as we know. It hit them very, very, very hard. So finally, in 1976, you had who were called the Philadelphia 11, which were a group of 11 deaconesses. And you have to remember, back in the 50s, so just 20 years before, you couldn't even have altar girls in an Episcopal church. And then they first allowed it, and you had to get Episcopal approval. So you had to get approval from your bishop to even use an altar girl. So this wasn't like a liberal Episcopal church. This was just as conservative as you would think of Roman liturgy, theology, and practice during the time. It was still very conservative. But in the 70s, as it went for everybody, it wasn't going too good for the Episcopal Church. And then they had the Philadelphia 11. And what happened is you had at the meeting of bishops, they said, hey, what are we going to do with these Philadelphia 11? And a bishop stood up and was like, actually, they're valid. Let's let them, blah, 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 blah. And finally, they eventually allowed it. And then at the next, I think it was the next General Assembly, they had gave just a universal allowance for the court ordination of females to the priesthood, which was a disaster. So at this moment, what you had is obviously you're going to have a group within the Episcopal Church, the very conservative Episcopal Church, who isn't going to like this. So they met in St. Louis and they had the St. Louis Congress or Convention. Gosh, I haven't been thinking about this stuff in a while, so some of the details um, are a bit Congress of St. Louis. There you go, the Congress of St. Louis. So what you had is you had a bunch of laymen, priests, and even a few bishops who met in St. Louis and said, "Look, guys, we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. We really need to do something about this." So what they decided to do is there was a strong Tractarian, not really Tractarian per se, a strong ritualist element within these group of laymen, bishops, and priests who decided eventually to break off and to tell the Episcopal Church to take a hike. They invited the Church of England and the rest of the communion to go with them and help them. But this was it wasn't too much of a success, and within a few years, you had splinter group after splinter group, and the movement was never really viable, unfortunately. So, if we fast forward this to the early 2000s, you had a group which was called the Traditional Anglican Communion, which ever since all of the splinters from the original, what's called the continuing movement, ever since those original splinters, you had a bunch of groups that wanted to, how do I put this? They wanted to come together and bring back that original unity that they had in the Congress of St. Louis. They wanted the conservative Anglo-Catholicism to have a unified sort of head, and the TAC, the Traditional Anglican Communion, was one of those groups. They had, I want to think, around 1 million members, so it wasn't like a tiny group, but definitely wasn't anything massive like the rest of the Anglican Communion in union with Canterbury. So they, during their meeting of bishops, decided that they wanted to have full union with Rome. They begged the Holy Office. They begged Pope Benedict. I think Pope Benedict was in during this time. They begged Pope Benedict XVI, please, 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 Pope Benedict, let us come in. We promise. They took the Catechism of the Catholic Church and signed it on the altar. All of the bishops did, and they said, please, 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 will you let us in? And finally, to everybody's surprise, Pope Benedict came out with Anglicanorum Cedibus in 2008. So this was the formation of the Ordinariates. So the Ordinariates were formed in order to have that Anglican patrimony, which is going to be the patrimony of the Church of England. Many people ask, why isn't the Sarum practiced, or why isn't that practiced? Well, because it's a pastoral provision to allow for the conversion of former Anglicans. It isn't like you would think about like the Melkite Church or the Byzantine Catholic Church. It's not like that. It's a provision within the Latin Church to allow some of the liturgical expression to continue, to allow for the conversion of priests and bishops to continue in their pastoral role over the faithful. It is really a provisional sort of thing. So there was a lot in England who converted to this, multiple bishops, extremely famous bishops, a lot of them. And then in Australia, too, there was an ordinariate. And then in America, you had the ordinariate chair of St. Peter, too. And there weren't as many conversions in America, but it still wasn't a tiny number. But in England, oh my gosh, there was just loads, like all of the conservative priests in the Church of England. But going back to our continuum friends in the TAC, right when Pope Benedict XVI came out with Anglicanorum Cedibus, they were like, actually, never mind, guys. We're gonna kind of scram. Except there was one bishop, one archbishop actually, who did convert. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but currently the parish which he was at, the cathedral, is Incarnation Catholic Church in Orlando, which is a very important Ordinariate church down there. And I actually have been there on multiple occasions. One beautiful, beautiful church. So that is kind of the background. So why is there the beef between us, true Anglo-Catholics, the Ordinariate Catholics, and the trad Anglicans? Well, you see, with a lot of continuing Anglicans, they were they definitely were extremely papist. Belief in purgatory, seven sacraments, transubstantiation. The whole nine yards. They were John Henry Newman's Track 90 on steroids. But when it came time to put your money on the table, a lot of them didn't convert. There are some personal issues, let's say, why we can guess a lot of the Anglicans didn't convert, and it may or may not have to do with a few divorces here or there. I'm not speculating, but for a lot of, if you sit down and talk to a continuum priest, and I've asked one, that's the speculation around town, because unfortunately that, at least when it comes to the old guard, a lot of the new guard that I've met, they're really, really good people, amazing people. But a lot of the old guard bishops, they got some issues, let's say. But for example, like Archbishop Jones of the I can't remember all of these churches anymore. Archbishop Chandler Holder Jones, he is an absolute goat. I love the man. He's great. He's amazing. Archbishop Chad's great. But a lot of the old guard, they weren't as they had purple fever. They wanted the purple cassock. They led schisms just to get the episcopate. These guys, they didn't join. But a lot of the reasoning for the other Anglicans. So you have the ACNA, a lot of those who stayed in the Episcopal Church, the REC, the current Church of England, and then even some of the Continuum who genuinely, who are more genuine about their disagreement, like some people from a lot of outside of the TAC. There's some people who genuinely just don't agree with the Roman Church, and they didn't make any promises about corporate reunion or anything like that. What's their problem? Well, their problem is that the Ordinariate really is a genuine the genuine claim to medieval Catholicism. That's really what it is. It's a genuine claim to medieval Catholicism in England, where before they were the only guys, and we hadn't really even reestablished the hierarchy in England. But now, not only have we reestablished the hierarchy, but we have a means and instrument for bringing Anglicans back, which has been very, very successful. I've talked to people at the Ordinariate who say they'll get calls from Anglican priests once or twice a week, asking questions about having reunion with Rome. That's just the Ordinary Chair of St. Peter. I can't imagine how it is in England, because it was just a mass amount of people, just thousands of just priests who came over from the Church of England. So that's why they see it as a sheep stealing operation, a shepherd stealing operation. But it's not stealing if they weren't sheep or weren't shepherds to begin with.